Well, hi there. I'm Dr. Tom Ulrich, and I like to talk about leadership at... Oh, wait, that's the wrong video. That's for the fan club. Leadership and engineering. Hey, in today's video, I want to talk about transformational leadership. So I think I mentioned in a couple of the other videos, just kind of in passing, that this is the most heavily researched leadership model that there is. There was one literature review I came across that had identified over 2,000 peer-reviewed articles on transformational leadership. Just to kind of put that in perspective on situational leadership, I think there's a grand total of 3 as compared to 2,000. And for all the other ones, there are various numbers. So there's hundreds and hundreds of ones on servant leadership and authentic leadership and the LMX and so on. But transformational leadership is kind of the king. And initially, it was proposed by James McGregor Burns, and in about 1978 in his book called Leadership. And it was really refined and put into its really present-day form by Bernie Bass in his book in 1985. At any rate, so transformational leadership, a lot of times what you'll hear is people will talk about the 4 I's of transformational leadership. So the first one is inspirational motivation. So the component of inspirational motivation has to do with, it prescribes that as leaders, we're consumed with the idea of motivating our leaders, or motivating our people, the leaders under us as well as our people. And that's a huge thing with all of the modern leadership paradigms, is moving people from a place where they do things because they have to a place where they do things because they want to. So that's where you can see, the command and control and all these other, old deals. They don't address this. So that's the first thing is, when you're a leader, trying to be a transformational leader, you are first and foremost in the motivation business. The second one is idealized influence. Now, that sounds not all that different from inspirational motivation, and what you'll see in the academic journals is sometimes people, when they write articles on transformational leadership, they'll actually combine these two into one. Nonetheless, I think the distinction is pretty good, and the idea of idealized influence is, we're looking to influence people as if it were an ideal world. So, we've got this idea of what would the ideal boss be, and it would include inspiration, but it would also include the ideas that you never have to resort to the hammer. You never have to suspend the rules of civility. It's just this sort of, if it really was an ideal world, what would leadership look like? And that's the idea of idealized influence. By the way, as an engineer, they talk about the 4 I's of transformational leadership. I acknowledge this one has got 2, idealized influence, so it's really kind of the 5, but I'd say get over it. Anyway, the next one is individualized consideration. Now, with situational leadership, you had kind of this pretty narrow idea of treating people differently, and really it was just along a single axis, which is sort of how far along have they developed their skill. Well, with transformational leadership, you look at a myriad of things. You look at things, for instance, there's some sort of romantic version of the universe where we want to think, for instance, that all engineers are created equal, and if given the same chance, each engineer would be equally capable. Okay, and that's just ridiculous. I mean, I do think you could learn. I do think is how much time you put into it. But to use a basketball analogy, there is really only one Michael Jordan, and there is an element where we're not all given the same amount of tools. That's just reality. But the idea of individualized consideration is to take that into account, to take culture into account. I mean, the idea is to really think about all the different ways this person is unique, because it's only when you do that that you can really, as a leader, help someone become all that they can be. So you sort of tailor your leadership in every regard to make it specific. So the last thing we want to do is just kind of resort to this, treat everybody the same. In fact, a lot of ethics people and stuff, they kind of frame the question, is it really fair to treat people differently? And what they kind of come to is, given that everybody's different, it's actually the height of unfairness to treat everybody the same. Okay, and the final one is intellectual stimulation, and that's a helpful concept. So the idea, is as a leader, you're thinking about, will this stimulate them intellectually? So if you give somebody a job, like, okay, your job is to flip the hamburger, just sit there with the spatula all day long and flip, that's not stimulating anybody's intellect. And so as you're leading people and giving them assignments, and particularly with engineers, you're thinking about, what it is that they would be excited to learn about. And here's the big ticket. Well, how do you know? Well, maybe you could ask them. Maybe you could have an ongoing conversation. By the way, if you're the kind of leader that, once every set amount of period, every quarter, every half, every year, you sit down across the table and have a one-on-one, and you call it informal, but listen, when you walk one-on-one, walk into a conference room and they know this is our one-on-one, when you do that, that is anything but informal, and it's terrifying, and you're not going to get the true results. The way to do it is to have an ongoing relationship where you're just, as a matter of course, you're chatting and walking to get coffee, and make it a real relationship, not this sort of don't emphasize the fact that you're the boss. Emphasize the fact that you're that you're just two people who are friends. Ideally that's what it ought to be. Now, at any rate, so intellectual stimulation then is you're thinking. You're thinking about how to motivate people. You're thinking about making your influence ideal. You're thinking about how to make everything unique to the individual. And on top of all that is you've kind of got a game plan to keep them motivated, and it takes into account things like this. When you first do a certain kind of task, it's really exciting because you're on the steep learning curve, and and it's hard. You figure it out, and then the second time is a lot easier, and about the 15th time you do it, you're just like pulling your hair out, and so you don't fall into the trap of saying, oh, Bob, well, he's the guy who does this. Well, the problem, you start letting yourself think that way, then you're boring Bob to tears, so you deliberately mix it up, and that's good for the company, because what happens if Bob decides to quit or retire or get hit by a bus or whatever? You never want to have only one person who can do something. At any rate, so that's the skinny on transformational leadership. By the way, Peter Northouse, in his textbook, his definitive textbook, he notes that Kouzes and Posner's leadership challenge. At any rate, the Northouse says Kouzes and Posner's. That's actually a brand of transformational leadership. So in some of my other videos, you'll kind of see me talk about transformational leadership and then talk about them and like, what's that? Well, they don't use the 4 I's, but when you look at fundamentally what they're saying and fundamentally what Bass's 4 I's are, is you're talking about the same animal. At any rate, so that's those are some of my thoughts on transformational leadership. And for more of my videos, you can go to tomulrichconsulting.com. If you're on YouTube, I think if you search on Dr. Tom Ulrich, that seems to work. And I'm going by this moniker of engineering leadership guy. And if you search on that on YouTube, for now, it doesn't work real well, but I think over time it might. At any rate, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you later.